All right, my name is Sarah Caitlin Kerley, and today I'm going to be discussing the book, The Militarization of the Dominican Culture from the General's Captain to General Trujillo by Valentina Peguero. And I'm just going to kind of start off with a little bit of an overview history of the Dominican Republic, because I always think it's good to just, know a little bit about the history before you start something like that. The island Hispaniola was discovered by Columbus in 1492, claimed for the Spanish crown, obviously, like a lot of the other Latin American countries. 1795 is when the French ownership of the island kind of began, when the Spaniards ceded as a consequence from the French Revolutionary Wars. The French held power until about 1808, when the island returned to the Spanish crown. And then in 1822, the island, or the country, became under control of Haiti. Around 1844, February 27th, is when the country declared independence from Haiti by the Trinitarios, who were just a group of three men who were against the Haitians being under control of the country. November 6th of 1844 is when the first Constitution was adopted, and it was modeled after the U.S. Constitution. Then in 1863, we had the War of Restoration, which was between Spain and guerrilla fighters after Spain tried to gain control of the country once again. 2 years later, in 1865, Spain abandoned the country and just left the Dominicans to rule their country for themselves. They were a huge sugarcane industry, and the U.S. being the largest creditor nation because the U.S. held a lot of the sugarcane plantations. So we've got independence now in the Dominican Republic, and we're going to have our first free election in 1914, and a man by the name of Juan Jimenez is going to come to power. He's only going to rule the country for about 2 years when there's going to be a coup led by the military, which is going to force him to resign. This is when the U.S. is going to step in and begin their occupation in May of 1916. This is when also the United States established a military government for the Dominican Republic. And the United States was in the country until about 1922. They left in about late October. And then there were free elections held in March of 1924. Horacio Vasquez was elected, which he held power for about 6 years, and he was forced into exile by our General Trujillo, which is where our main point of our discussion is going to be led. Trujillo ran for election. He was virtually unopposed, won about 95% of the vote, which was in what was known as a sham election. He presented himself as a savior to the Dominicans and said that there is no danger in following me. He promised that if the people favored him with their votes, he would never use his power to tyrannize the population, and he promised political stability and prosperity as well. The Dominican Congress proclaimed the beginning of the Trujillo era when he was elected in 1930. He established absolute political control while promoting economic development. Then when the Depression rolled around about 1929, it left the country completely broke, like many of the other Latin American countries. It deteriorated the economy, threatening the stability of the regime. The National Guard was Trujillo's main source of power. He used it to repress the Dominican people, and the regime saw the expansion of the Guard into one of the largest military forces in Latin America at this time. About 1940, the Dominican military was spending roughly about 21% of the national budget. Trujillo uses the power to remain in control by repressing the Dominicans. He develops an elaborate system of espionage and intelligence agencies. He requires his citizens to carry ID cards and good conduct passes from the secret police. One of the biggest, I guess you would say, points of Trujillo's regime that is mostly remembered is the Parsley Massacre of 1937, when Trujillo ordered the killing of between 17,000 and 35,000 Haitians because of Haiti's alleged support for Dominican exiles that were plotting to overthrow the Dominican regime. It caused international criticism of Trujillo, and he called for a new policy called the Dominicanization of the frontier, which was basically saying that he wanted everything to be Dominican. He didn't want any other races or any other nationalities in his country. Everything was going to be named Dominican. They were going to throw out everything that was Spanish, French, what have you. During the Cold War, he named himself the #1 anti-communist, which was a little ironic because he was an admirer of both Hitler and Mussolini. He did, however, support the Allies. And like many of the other Latin American countries, World War II brought increased demand on Dominican exports. And the 40s and the 50s saw huge economic growth, which made Trujillo's popularity grow even more. When the 50s rolled around, we saw a lot of mismanagement and corruption that resulted in major economic problems, and we saw the economy deteriorating. But mostly because Trujillo was not spending the national budget wisely. He held a festival to celebrate the 25th anniversary of his regime, and he spent a lot of money on sugar plantations and the sugar industry. He was assassinated on May 30th of 1961 by a group of Dominican rebels. His regime was very oppressive. Thousands were murdered, imprisoned. And one of the biggest quotes that I was able to find about the Trujillo regime was that his rule brought the country more stability and prosperity than any living Dominican had previously known. The price, however, was high. Civil liberties were non-existent. Supporters of Trujillo claimed that he recognized both the state and the economy and left vast infrastructure to the country. His detractors point to the brutality of his rule and also claim that much of the country's wealth wound up in the hands of the family or his close associates. So that's just a little background on the Dominican history. So this is a point where I'm going to kind of delve into the book review. So I'll just give you a little bit about the little background on the author, Valentina Peguero. She received her bachelor's in education from a Catholic university in the Dominican Republic. She received her master's and her PhD from Columbia University in New York City. She focuses mostly on modern and Caribbean history, as well as Latin American history and its culture. Her special emphasis are ethnicity and race, Caribbean women's history, Dominican political and military history. She has just recently been recognized as a contributor to the Library of Congress's Handbook of Latin American Studies. And she's born and raised in the Dominican Republic and lived there during and after the Trujillo regimes. So I think she's very well educated to have written this book. And this book, oddly enough, there's not a lot of academic work out there about the Dominican Republic. So her book is not only a wonderful overview of the Dominican history, it's a great overview of the Dominican culture and especially of Trujillo's regime. So she claims that the military played a large role in shaping the Dominican culture during Trujillo's regime. Her book's main point is to examine the evolution of the Dominican military history and its impact on society from colonial times through the Trujillo era, with the latter of the two being her main point. Although the military had always had a large role in Dominican culture since colonial times prior to Trujillo's regime, it greatly expanded under his rule to ensure stability for his regime. She states that Trujillo used the armed forces to impose a new order in society that allows soldiers to enact extensively with citizens. His rule was repressive, authoritarian, paternalistic, personal, and totalitarian. She also argues that this would continue on into current Dominican culture as it became an ingrained idea in the Dominican culture. Although her main argument is that of the Trujillo regime and the impact of his military, she gives an extensive overview of the role of the military during colonial times and pre-Trujillo eras, especially during the U.S. occupation of the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 1924. Her central theme is further delved upon with the second part of her book, which chronicles the expansion of the military under Trujillo. She examines the military's rising budget, troop and weaponry levels, and training at home and abroad, as well as its extension into further reaches of the Dominican society. She shows the military's professionalism while at the same time contradicting it. Trujillo often demoted and promoted his soldiers based on political and nepotistic reasons. She argues that Trujillo's policies made it possible for the military to be a primary avenue for social mobility. This elevated his popularity even more because it made it a possible profession for rural and poor young men to promote their social statuses. Peguero is able to support her arguments with interviews conducted with former Trujillo servicemen. His regime was increasingly oppressive and with brainwashing, censorship of the press, incarceration, murder, deception, and indoctrination. By this, Trujillo was able to create a culture of obedience, with his military being the key factor. The murder of Jesus Maria de Galindez and the murders of the Maribal sisters, all committed by Trujillo's agents, were exemplary of just how oppressive his regime was. In closing, she claims that Trujillo's militaristic policy had a tremendous impact on the Dominican Republic, leading to the Dominican Army being one of the most powerful in the Caribbean. He was assassinated on May 30th, 1961 by a group of Dominican rebels after years of unrest. Although Peguero's main theme was to examine the impact of the military of the Dominican culture, what I took away from this book really was a very broad understanding and specific history of not only the Trujillo regime, but of the Dominican Republic as a whole. Due to the limited amount of academic work published on the Dominican Republic, I believe that her book offers a good understanding of many different aspects of the Dominican Republic and should be read by any of you who are interested in furthering your knowledge on the Dominican Republic. So, thank you for tuning in. This is Caitlin once again.